on, and we are live.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the media. Good evening, Barbados. We are gathered today to give another update on the situation relating to COVID-19 and its impact on Barbados and the various sectors, and exactly what happens going forward from today. With me is Minister of Labour and Social Partnership Relations, the Honourable Colin Jordan, and representing the Congress of Trade Unions and Staff Association, Mr. Edwin O'Neill. Today is the first time that we are doing a digital press conference recognizing social distancing. So there are no members of the media present, but they are all logged in online and will ask questions, and we will do the responses that way. So I'll turn you over now to Minister Jordan.
Good afternoon, media. Good afternoon, Barbados. We've just been engaged with some key leaders, a subcommittee of the social partnership, and essentially what we were speaking to today had to do with preparing for a stage 3 situation. And so I've come from that meeting to share with you. From the medical personnel, there are no new cases in the testing that has been done, completed so far, so that the number of positive cases for COVID-19 remains at 17. Much of the discussion we had in our meeting earlier spoke to the impact on workers and what that would mean as we move from stage 2, or if we had to move, if and when we move from stage 2 to stage 3. So we had discussion about essential services. We engaged in discussion on work arrangements and alternative work arrangements. We had discussion on what workers would experience, what life would look like to some degree if we moved from stage 2 to stage 3 in our stages of the development of our response to COVID-19 as an epidemic. Now, as it relates to workers, we want to reemphasize what Mr. Morris would have spoken to earlier, the matter of physical distance between people. The virus passes when people are in close proximity to each other. And we want to emphasize that in businesses and organizations that employ people, that distancing has to be respected. And so we expect that those who lead in organizations will make the arrangements that would allow for people to have that distance in between themselves as they work. We recognize that there are ways of living that Barbadians have become accustomed to, because even coming to this press conference, coming on the stairs of the Warren's office center, I saw people who were not workers, but who were still in very close proximity to each other, because that is how people feel comfortable. But we want, from a workplace perspective, for those who lead workers' organizations, those who lead businesses, those who lead employing organizations generally, to adhere to the arrangement of having physical distance between and among workers. And I think that should be at the base of how businesses and other employing organizations manage their affairs. There have been situations reported about clustering in certain establishments and people feeling uncomfortable. COVID-19 is not a scenario to be trifled with, and so we would expect that while people go about their normal business still, we would want all the appropriate precautions to be taken to ensure that there is not the kind of spread that would cause us to have to move to the next stage. All of that said, we as a government believe in being proactive. And so while we are not yet at that stage, we do not know if and when it will happen. And we have been fully engaged in the planning that will allow us to respond if and when we move to that stage. I would also want to share, as Minister also responsible for social partnership relations, that we have been receiving relatively good responses from the business sector as it relates to partnering with government in outfitting our quarantine locations as well as outfitting our isolation centers. And I want, on behalf of government, to encourage businesses and other organizations who are able to continue and to deepen that partnership. We are in uncharted waters, and we face potentially a very, very difficult situation. And so we're going to have to face this challenge together. Government is not going to be able to bear all the costs, and the private sector and businesses and other employing organizations are not going to be able to bear all the costs. But we can do it together. We believe we have the resources, we have the goodwill, and so we are calling on the social partners, particularly commercial and philanthropic organizations, to continue the partnership that you've started and to deepen that partnership so that together we can have in place all the adequate supplies and equipment that would allow for the medical authorities, the health authorities, to be able to manage this situation on the island. And with that, I think I should probably now go directly into any questions that you may have for me.
Minister Jordan.
Hey.
Yes. Have you been in touch with the NIS as to the anticipated fallout that is expected? I mean, we already heard Minister Simmons yesterday referencing quite a few hotels that will be closing their doors, etc. Have you been in touch with the NIS regarding that anticipated fallout and their capabilities to handle that fallout, and for how long?
The National Insurance Board met late last week and have put in place a number of systems that will allow them to handle the potential fallout from this situation. And those capabilities, I think, have been issued to the media, or should have been issued to the media today. They include applying for benefits online, and within the National Insurance Department, they have put and are continuing to put systems in place that will allow them to deal with what could potentially be significantly higher than normal volumes of applications. So the National Insurance Department is ready, has been fine-tuning those systems since last week, and they will be ready to handle that increase in unemployment claims, to the National Insurance Scheme.
Okay. And with regards to...
I should also say, before you move on,
sorry, go ahead.
The Prime Minister, I'm just repeating something the Prime Minister would have said on Friday evening, and that is the step that previously would have been required, where there is a stamping of a form at the E. Humphrey Walcott building, and then a person would have to go to the Barbados Employment and Career Counseling Services to have counseling before they went back to National Insurance. That step, Prime Minister indicated on Tuesday, has been suspended in this period. So that is also to assist in the facilitation, because we would not want long queues of people in any location, along with wanting to expedite the payment of unemployment benefits. And so the online processing will be allowed to work, and there will not be the need for queuing in any place to be able to obtain the unemployment benefits.
Yesterday, Minister Simmons as well outlined some of the displacement already taking place in the hotel sector. 24 hotels, I think, that he would have mentioned and counting. Um, are you now getting a greater sense of the type of displacement within the workforce? I mean, are other companies reaching out to you to telling you of what type of displacement or what type of job losses that we might be looking at because of the unpredictability of the situation?
Well, like I said, we've been just meeting, strategizing for a worst case scenario. Once tourism arrivals dry up, there is a significant knock-on effect. And we know that even without having to face a COVID-19 situation, because much of the economy is driven by our tourist arrivals. So that when we speak to hotels and restaurants and other direct services, those are things that are known. But lots of construction is also driven by tourism. Then there are the distributive trades, both on duty-free side and on food and beverage. So there is a knock-on effect, and we would expect that there will be impact, negative impact, once tourism contracts across a range of sectors. There are some sectors that may be able to continue their work using the technology. International business may be one such sector, but a number of sectors will be impacted. We believe, though, that agriculture is one that can see some expansion at this point, because we have to rely, and I think the Minister of Agriculture would have spoken to this on Friday as well in the House of Assembly. We are continuing to push, because we started before we got to this situation, to get additional persons involved in farming. And so we expect to see it pick up in agriculture, while we see the contraction and decline in tourism and in tourism-related industries.
Minister Jordan, good evening. Can you give us an indication as to how many tests done in the last 24 hours, and what is the condition of the 17 persons who have tested? Dr. Best would have said previously that they were mild. So just can you tell us if they're still mild, and how many tests were done in the last 24 hours?
I'm going to invite the Acting Chief Medical Officer to respond to that.
Hi, good afternoon. The Best DeSantis Public Health Lab would have done 132 tests as of yesterday. You asked also about the status of the 17 persons who are COVID positive. They range from mild to, I think there were 2 cases that were not quite moderate, but persons that we had to pay very close attention to. And they're all stable. We don't have any concerns right now, any major concerns with any of the persons who are in isolation.
Dr. Best, with regards to the contact tracing, how far are we along where that is concerned at the moment? By the way, this is our call from Monty Barbados today.
Yeah. So just as a reminder, contact tracing is perhaps one of the most critical interventions that we're doing from a health perspective. When you perform contact tracing, you're able to identify new cases, and you're able to stop the spread of the disease, and therefore you are able to contain more effectively. So we started contact tracing from the very first person that was identified, the very first 2 cases, and through contact tracing we have identified 8 additional cases through contact tracing. The contact tracing teams are based in the polyclinics. So essentially we would assign a team based on the catchment area that related to where the person is residing, and the teams go out and they do aggressive contact tracing through history of where they've been in the last few days, and then they go to those persons who they came into contact with, and ask them if they have any symptoms in keeping with COVID-19. And for those who have symptoms suggestive of COVID-19, a swab is done to determine if in fact they have it.
But guess what I'm
Dr.
driving
Bliss.
at? In terms of the 17 persons that you were conducting the contact tracing on, how close are you to wrapping up that process, or is it still a ways off?
No, but listen, for every single case that we get, we do a set of contact tracing. I think your question is a little bit tricky because you're asking, did we finish contact tracing for a particular individual, and how many of the 17 have we finished contact tracing for? That's a little tricky for me to answer because it is a very involved process.
Dr. Best, you mentioned 132 cases, but you didn't indicate how many cases
132
have
tests.
were done.
Yes.
Tests, right? How many tests were done since the last information that came yesterday?
So we did 11 tests, if I remember correctly, on Sunday, and none of them were positive. So that's what brought the total up to 132.
Did any of these persons who went from mild to just a little higher in terms of your sickness level, did they require particular medication or just observation?
They required a little bit more than observation. One of the cases was an asthmatic, so the COVID-19 disease would have exacerbated her chronic asthma condition. So that's one of the cases that we had to pay very close attention to in terms of making sure that that person didn't deteriorate. So the special medication would basically be indicated based on what needed to be done for that particular person. So in that case, we had to treat that person's asthma and continue to monitor them.
This is a question for the minister again. With regards to, we realize that the majority of Barbadian employers would be seeking to do their civic duty, but is there any, in terms of trying the best to keep as many employees as possible, is there any concern along the way of some that might use this opportunity to try to unburden excess staff that they might have, or try to downsize as much as possible? Is that a concern, or has that entered into your permutations at all?
We've been in discussion with some of the leadership of the business sector, and I'd say to you that at this point, there is a recognition that this is a national issue and that we have to approach it together. And the sense that I get is that the vast majority of organizations, employing organizations, are well-meaning and well-run organizations, but the sense I get is that they are prepared to bring any that you or I or anybody else may consider to be wanting to do things that may not be in the best interest of people. I get the impression, the distinct impression, that they are willing to work with us and to work with those organizations, the few organizations that they may be, to make sure that we all do this together.
Okay. Also, I am getting reports of an elderly man in a St. Peter hotel who's unable to enter Trinidad. He was unable to enter Trinidad, but he's housed in a St. Peter hotel. Could you give me an update on that, sir?
I can't give an update on something I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, you're not aware of it. Okay.
Not aware of it.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Minister, good evening again. There has been some speculation about 35 Trinidad and Tobago nationals being facilitated by the Barbados government because they were unable to be repatriated to their country. Confirm that. And if it is true, tell us what, if any, arrangement would have been made or how the arrangement by the Barbados government to facilitate these 35 Trinidad and Tobago nationals.
I cannot give you significant detail on that, but I can confirm to you that some Trinidadian nationals have come to Barbados. They are unable immediately to go on to Trinidad and Tobago. They are also unable to go back to the UK. And so this government is not going to leave them at the airport. But this government is also going to ensure that there is no contact with Barbadians. There is nothing that says they are infected with anything. And so they will follow the protocol, and that will be enforced, of the mandatory quarantine. And that is the position that we take at this point on that. We continue to be in discussions with the government of Trinidad and Tobago to facilitate their repatriation.
Minister, should a Barbadian employee become infected with COVID-19 and have to be quarantined, is there a particular process or a different process that will come into play regarding how that person tries to get sickness benefits?
A Barbadian worker, I'm assuming by worker,
would have to be quarantined and would have to be quarantined. How then would that person be able to try to access the National Insurance Scheme to eventually receive sickness benefits?
Oh, in terms of access. Well, the access is online for national insurance. We would expect that a relative, a next of kin, that is not, we've not gone through in detail, but we believe that, like for most other situations outside of COVID-19, if a person is hospitalized and is unable to get to a particular place that they need to be, that some next of kin, some guardian will assist that person in the facilitation. And we believe, well, we would think that that would happen in a situation like this.
Good evening.
You could stay, yes, yeah, take you on.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the press. Good evening, Barbados. The threat of COVID-19 is real. It will impact on labor. We have been in discussions with government and with the private sector. It is a threat the likes of which we have not faced in modern times. But because of the goodwill, the recognition that we are all in this together, a number of innovative and creative responses are emerging and will likely continue to emerge as the crisis deepens. This consultation affords us the opportunity to sit across the table in the social partnership setting, and there has been the absence of rancor and hostility. And like I said a few moments ago, there has been the underlying reality that we are all in this together, and therefore the rigid separations that might otherwise exist has to be put under the carpet as we ride through this together. Labour is fully committed to doing its part. We recognize that we are a society governed by law, and the process of negotiations and consultations allows for a clearer and better understanding and a better working relationship. I will appeal to my colleagues in Labour that thus far we have demonstrated a level of maturity and responsibility, a willingness to be guided by the science and by the experts. And I can only urge that we continue in like manner as we ride through this crisis together. Thank you.
A question,
Minister?
Possible?
Sorry, hello?
Hello?
Go ahead, Victor.
Hi, Vic.
Yeah, Minister Vic Fernandez, Capital Media. There's a large body of self-employed workers, craftsmen, mechanics, all kinds of people, chefs and others across Barbados. How how are we providing for unemployment benefits? So those persons who fall outside of the normal NIS employer-employee relationship and who are self-employed, and the small operators who run their own little businesses.
I think on Friday, Prime Minister would have announced some assistance for persons. I think they maybe would have been particularly in the tourism or tourism-related industries, and I think chefs may fall under that, even though I do not remember it being that category being specifically mentioned. But there was going to be a requirement for them to be registered in order to access any benefit that may be available.
When you say registered, what do you mean?
Well, registered with NIS, because there has to be a knowledge of who these persons are. So there has to be a registration so that a determination can be made as to if and what kind of assistance would be rendered in a situation like that.
But what about those who are not registered, but who are employed and who have little businesses and so on? What happens to them and now they're totally unemployed? Is there any consideration for them?
Yes, well, the registration needs to happen and happen quickly, and that can happen with national insurance, and then we will take it from there. This may not be the time, but I am not going to allow it to pass to say that people need to register, need to pay national insurance contributions, because
Indeed.
what happens is that a system is set up. There are a certain number of contributions or people who contribute. The actuaries determine rates and payouts. When something happens and you have to veer away from what has been decided and agreed, then you put additional pressure on the system. I want to use this opportunity, even though this is maybe a national emergency kind of situation, but I'm still going to use the opportunity to ask people not to wait until these kinds of scenarios. Register with the National Insurance Department, pay your contributions. There are flexible arrangements. We're going to talk more about it after we get through this, but I just want to put that on the table at this point.
Thank you.
Good evening, Minister Jordan. Wendy Burke, Starcom Network News.
Hi, good evening.
I have two questions for you. The first one I wish for you as well as the SETU SAB rep to address, and that is the necessity for consultations with the Labour Office before the laying off of staff, especially in an instance where, say, a business may have to let go more of 50% because that amount may not necessarily be able to work remotely. That's my first question. My second question is, if we have to move to stage 3 and declare a state of emergency, what are the implications for businesses in part and also for the individuals?
Let me begin with the second question to say to you that I left the meeting that I referred to earlier discussing that very matter, what happens in stage 3 in a state of emergency kind of situation. And those details, as we speak, are being finalized. We are quite close to knowing exactly what is to be done. I think when I left, we were close to finalizing that. And that information is going to be made public, I think, tomorrow. But that is being finalized and tweaked as we speak and should be completed sometime tonight for sharing, I believe, maybe tomorrow. But what is certain is that once a stage 3 is announced, details will be given at that time as well. Full details will be given so that everybody is clear as to what is expected of the organization, what is expected of the individual, what are those essential services, what are the absolutely essential, what types of arrangements are to be put in place. That will be made very, very clear on any announcement of a stage 3. So that information is close to being finalized. You asked first about the requirement, if you can repeat that for me, Wendy, the requirement to go to the Labour Department if you're going to lay off a
Yes,
significant
the
number of persons.
question was, what is the necessity of consulting right now with the Labour Office
Right.
before
So-
making any staff layoffs, especially in an instance where it might be more than 50% of your complement?
So if I can go back to tourism, which is probably the first sector that would have been negatively impacted in a major way, we expect that those conversations would have already started. This is a situation that is very fluid, and I think those of us who watch the news internationally recognize that things can change very quickly. So that being very rigid is not what we have the luxury of at this point. And I think you heard, and you will hear from him again, but you would have heard the head of C2SAB speak to that. And he would have spoken to the maturity shown by the labor movement. Now, we would expect, though, that businesses have already been speaking to workers and workers' representatives, because this is not something that we're only starting to talk about today, Monday. We've been talking about this maybe for about 2 weeks already, so that workers and their representatives, as well as businesses, are aware of what is going on. And if you speak to workers in the tourism industry, they are aware, their unions are aware, and I think everybody knows what the potential can be. Everybody knows what the potential can be. So those discussions are ongoing at what we in industrial relations call the company level or the domestic level. They've also been taking place at the more national level. The Prime Minister would have met with a wide cross-section of leaders. She spoke to that on Friday as well, last week. And we were meeting earlier today, most of the afternoon, we were meeting with leaders in the trade union movement. So that conversation is taking place at the domestic level, but also at the national level. And as Mr. O'Neill said, the approach has been a very, very mature one.
Okay, I thank you for that response. I know I said only 2 questions,
But did you
but
want
I
Mr.
just want to
O'Neill
have
respond?
something clarified. And that is, how do we categorize what are the essential and non-essential services at this stage?
That you will know, you will get some indication of that maybe tomorrow. Like I said earlier, I left a meeting where that was being discussed. We are pretty much agreed, but I will share, for example, that something as basic as food needs to be available. I would also share that you would expect to have electricity supplied. So there are a number of things that are obvious. You would expect that persons who work in law and order would be at work. You would expect maybe that people who work in security generally would be at work, but specific details will be shared later. Those lists are being put together as we speak, and you will get that information not today, but maybe by as early as tomorrow.
Minister,
If I
again.
was,
Let's let Ms. O'Neill respond to Ms. Burke's question.
Go ahead.
hi, Wendy, the COVID-19 virus is a stage in the development, the history of Barbados. That this too shall pass, and we have to think of a Barbados post-COVID-19. And that's why I said that we have approached this with a level of maturity that in other circumstances might not have drawn it out. A national emergency is self-explanatory. For sure, the protective services, police, soldier, firemen, prison officers, by the nature of the job, will have to be at work. The curious thing is that for some reason, people don't widely appreciate that they are also workers and have the hope and the aspirations of any labor movement. There cannot be a Barbados if people are not being fed or have the opportunity to get food. So those persons in the distributive sector, the markets, the supermarkets, the shops, even in the face of a national emergency, will have to be considered and their role factored in to the whole society. And finally, no matter what legal framework is set, because we are human beings, we have to make provisions for exceptional circumstances and exceptional rules. The fact that these considerations have been on the table means that the elements of the social partnership are not removed or divorced from the wider society, because these are some of the very points that were articulated today and will continue to be as we have to fashion responses to an area where we have not gone before in modern times.
I thank you, Mr. O'Neill.
Minister Jordan, question for you.
Hey, go ahead.
There has been some back and forth in society about the capabilities of employers in terms of vacation, and if things become pretty slow in their businesses, sending persons on vacation or asking that they go on vacation. Can you provide, as Minister of Labour, some clarity regarding what employers can and cannot do? Understand that this is a very unique situation the country has not been in before.
I'm glad that you said it is a unique situation, a first time, at least for those of us who are alive now. And there is not much by way of guidance in terms of what we can look back at to guide us as to how we should handle some of these situations. That is why Prime Minister has been very clear to involve all the partners in the discussion. And so today, we discuss what were some of the options that could be used by employing organizations as it relates to their workers, and what could happen if they were on quarantine, for example, if they were isolated, if there was a total shutdown. All those things are being discussed. The private sector is crafting a number of options that can be used by employing organizations to address the very question that you are raising. Now, if you're asking a strictly legal question, then I would have to say to you that vacation and the scheduling of vacation is in the purview of the employer. That is if I take a strictly legal position, and it cannot be extended beyond, I think, 6 months after the anniversary date. There are those legal stipulations. We are in uncharted territory. It is unusual where we are, and so we are discussing, we are working together. We are working together to craft outcomes that would see human beings, workers, able to live through this, because as Mr. O'Neill said just now, there is going to be life after COVID-19. So we have to have workers who can get through this, people who can get through this. At the same time, when we get through this, we're going to need to have employing organizations that are still viable and can still continue business to allow all of us as a country to move beyond this. And so the private sector is working as we speak to craft a number of options, because there are some larger organizations that can take certain positions as it relates to their workers. There are mid-sized organizations that may have to have different approaches. And then there are going to be some smaller organizations that will have even different approaches to how they handle this situation as it relates to workers who may be off from work. And so there needs to be, and the private sector is working on this, a menu of options, as we call it a menu of options, that will give to organizations of varying sizes and varying strengths, varying financial, economic strengths, to be able to use some of those options, bearing in mind that people have to live, and post-COVID-19, Barbados has to bounce back and keep going.
Thank you, Minister. Question for Dr. Best, please.
Go ahead, Barry.
Dr. Best, good evening again. Can you give an indication as to if or to the volume of Barbadians who are presenting to polyclinics believing they are symptomatic, and if any tests have been done on Barbadians that would have presented?
Yeah, that's a great question, Barry. So let me answer the question a different way. Since we set up the hotline that you are aware of, we've received a lot of calls about persons who are having respiratory symptoms. What we do at the hotline is that we evaluate those persons and then we make suggestions as to where they can go. In some cases, it involves us making a referral to a polyclinic or to their regular doctor once we are pretty sure that they don't have COVID-19. What we don't have are the data to show the numbers of persons who are calling in with possible respiratory complaints. We also don't have the number of persons with respiratory complaints that come to us from private clinics, for instance, or even from polyclinics. What I can say is that the index of suspicion is there, which is a very good thing. So a lot of doctors are calling us to consult with us. And when I say us, I'm talking about myself and other members of the team, because that's the only way we're going to get on top of this. We need to have a certain index of suspicion to then say, well, let us do a test. So I mentioned 132, that's the end result of it. So these are persons who would have had respiratory symptoms. You're not going to test somebody who does not have any respiratory symptoms.
One last question, Doc. Should we do have a patient that reaches a stage of the virus being severe, are we in a position to treat him or her in terms of medicine? Do we have medicine in country that we can treat?
Barry, absolutely. So let me just remind you that there's no specific antimicrobial for coronavirus, for this strain of coronavirus. So the medicines that we have are the supportive medicines. So when a person is in an ICU bed, there are different medicines that are required. So that is, I think you're asking about critical. So if you're in a critical stage or if you have severe disease, we can give supportive therapy. So you're giving oxygen, for instance. If the person is on a ventilator, you'll have to give different medications to keep their blood pressure up and to keep them alive and to sustain them. So we have those.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Question for Minister Jordan.
Hi, go ahead.
Yeah, Minister. I mean, we have no idea how long this COVID-19 crisis will last, and clearly, therefore, the resources of the NIS will be severely stretched. If I might use a quote from a former prime minister, you're likely to have sore nipples. My question to you is, in a prolonged environment, are we giving thought to some creative ways in which labor can be kept employed? For example, let's look at the duty-free sector, for example. That is a sector that is going to be, like many others, all of the tourism-related things, going to be severely tested. I'm seeing that restaurants are offering takeouts and specials and that kind of stuff to be able to keep their staff employed and alive and so on. But what about that sector, that large body of people, the tourism, duty-free sector? Is government giving any consideration, perhaps, to the waiver for a limited period of time up to a particular sum of money for Barbadians who may want to purchase stuff within the duty-free sector? Is that something that might be under consideration?
That I'm not able, Vic, to answer. That it would be a matter for the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs. That is not something that we discuss in relation to workers and the structure that work and work-related activities will take. If you're asking about what are some of the other things that people can get involved in, you spoke to the matter of takeout from restaurants. And we've also suggested, and I think others have as well, because we're not pretending to have a monopoly on the ideas. Others have suggested, and we've suggested as well, that maybe those taxi operators can get involved in delivery of food, delivery of pharmaceuticals, and so find other ways of being gainfully employed in a situation like the one that faces us at this point.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen of the media. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Neill. We will continue to update you, as I said earlier, on the developments related to COVID-19. But one thing I would like to point out is that given the pressure that is being placed on frontline personnel to face the press on a daily basis, we have decided that the distribution of information via this means would now be reduced to at least 2 times a week, so that the Chief Medical Officer and his counterparts can do the critical things relating to the control of COVID-19. And therefore we will let you know when we will hold the next one, but we will keep you updated on information, and we will continue to provide information in relation to our international obligations. One other note, the Attorney General, the Honorable Dale Marshall, will address a number of issues during the evening news on CBC, so you can tune in to see his responses, particularly to the issue of the Trinidadians who are now in Barbados, and in terms of what government's position is on them and what is likely to happen in the coming days. So thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you.